profited off the users was precluded by Section 230. They might not have won, but they never even had a chance to get their case tried. These are just two instances of Section 230 locking the courthouse doors to people with real-world injuries caused by online actions. Since I have chaired this subcommittee, we have held multiple hearings on this issue. We've heard from CEOs of the largest tech platforms, we've heard from small platforms, we've heard from experts, and we've heard from those most affected by these behaviors. And these oversight activities didn't start with me, though. Republicans have been investigating this issue as well. They have a number of discussion drafts and bills they have introduced. Many of those ideas are worth exploring. The concept of not providing immunity for platforms' algorithms, for example, are in both the Justice Against Malicious Algorithms Act that I've introduced and Mrs. McNorris-Rogers' discussion draft. There's a bipartisan desire to reform the court's interpretation of Section 230, and the American public wants to see us get things done. I urge all my colleagues, Republican and Democratic, to bring their ideas forward now, and let's work together on bipartisan legislation, because we can't continue to wait. The largest tech companies would like nothing more than for Congress to fight amongst itself while nothing happens. And they welcome those complaining about process, claiming that Congress doesn't understand or saying that this would break the internet, because these platforms don't want to be held accountable. The users suffering harm deserve better from us, and we will act. But for the pandemic, we would have some of these victims with us in the room today. And while they cannot be here in person, the family of Wesley is watching today. Matthew Herrick is watching today. And the advocates for children and marginalized groups and victims' rights are watching today. To start today, we will hear from experts about the harms we are seeing online. And our second expert panel will focus on proposals to reform Section 230. And in a little over a week, Chairwoman Schakowsky will continue this series in her subcommittee, reviewing legislation that can bring additional transparency and accountability for the problems we consider today. I want to thank all our panelists for joining us, and I look forward to their testimony. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time to Congresswoman Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding to me. By way of background, I was on the conference committee for the 1996 Telecom Act, and I continue to strongly believe in Section 230's core benefit, which is to protect user speech. But algorithms select what content will appear, personalized for each user. The platform is then more than just a conduit, transferring one user's speech to others. Platforms should not be immune from courts examining if algorithmic amplification causes harms. And that's the core idea of the two bills I've co-led. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this highly important hearing, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes my good friend, Mr. Latta, the ranking member for the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, my good friend and chairman. I greatly appreciate it. And I also want to thank our witness panel for being here today to discuss the potential legislative reforms of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Republicans on the Energy and Commerce Committee are leading on ways to hold big tech companies accountable for the harms caused by their platforms. In January, we announced our Big Tech Accountability Platform, which began our efforts to take a comprehensive look at ways to reform Section 230. I am proud Republicans have been focused on and remain focused on reconsidering the extent to which big tech deserves to retain their significant liability protections. Every step of the way, we have encouraged our Democratic colleagues to join us in the quest to hold big tech accountable while evaluating how we can reform Section 230. We sought input from the public on their concerns with big tech, from stakeholders on ways to stop censorship while protecting small businesses and innovation, and from members of Congress on proposals that they have supported. Hearing from the public, stakeholders, and members of Congress informed the discussion drafts that every Republican on this committee released in July. Our discussion drafts range from amending Section 230 to holding big tech accountable for taking down constitutionally protected speech and facilitating illegal drug sales to increasing transparency requirements on how social media companies moderate content. Section 230 became law in 1996 in response to several court cases, most notably Stratton Oakmont versus Prodigy Services, to allow online platforms to moderate unlawful or indecent content without fear of liability. It has two main components: a provision that exempts platforms from being liable for content that is posted on their site by a third-party user, and a second provision that exempts platforms from being liable for content that they remove in good faith. The internet has grown substantially since 1996, and it is clear big tech has abused this power granted to them by Congress.
Enter the event panelist numeric password, followed by pound.
They censor conservative voices and use algorithms to suppress content that does not fit their narrative. They hide research that shows the negative impact their platforms have on the mental health of our children. They allow the sale of illegal drugs on their platforms, including fentanyl, which we all know is killing Americans every day. While these actions are happening on big tech platforms, users have no recourse. When conservatives are silenced, the appeals process, if it exists, can be difficult to navigate. Big tech hides behind Section 230 to avoid liability for real-world harms their platforms are causing, including harms to our children. Section 230 is supposed to protect platforms from removing content in good faith, but says nothing about their liability for when they are acting as bad stewards of their platforms. To address this issue, I've offered a carve-out Section 230 protections for platforms that purposely promote, solicit, or facilitate material by another information content provider if the platform knew or had reason to know that the kind of intent would violate criminal federal law. When big tech acts as bad stewards on their platforms or as bad Samaritans, they should no longer be entitled to protections under Section 230. We will also discuss legislation noticed on today's hearing, which I am concerned could lead to unintended consequences like curtailing free speech and innovation. Section 230 reform must be taken seriously, and any legislative proposal that eventually gets enacted must be thoroughly vetted. We're at a pivotal time for free speech in America. It is our generation's turn to uphold the rights on which our country was founded. I look forward to hearing feedback from the witnesses on the proposals in front of us today. And before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask the unanimous consent that Dr. Burgess, who's not a member of the subcommittee, but a distinguished member of the full committee, be able to wave on to the committee.
Yeah, without objection.
Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Today's hearing is the first of two in which this committee will discuss legislative reforms to hold social media companies accountable. And we have two panels today. The first will focus on the insidious problems from which some social media platforms online are profiting. And the second will consider how reforms to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act can play a part in addressing those problems. And then next week, in a Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee hearing, we'll discuss how consumer protection-focused proposals can increase these companies' accountability to the public. Now, these two legislative hearings come after years of repeated bipartisan calls for online platforms to change their ways. Since 2018, we've held 6 hearings examining tech platforms' accountability, and our members have sent countless letters. The most prominent online platforms have repeatedly feigned ignorance before this committee, but our suspicions, unfortunately, have been repeatedly confirmed, the latest coming from former Facebook employee Frances Haugen. We learned how the platforms downplayed research that teen girls were especially vulnerable and suffering online. We've learned how executives knew their algorithms amplify harmful and divisive content and rejected proposals to fix the issue. We've seen a pattern of platforms highlighting COVID-19 and misinformation, conspiracy theories, and divisiveness. We've learned that during a civil rights audit, one platform failed to disclose that its algorithms disproportionately harm minority groups. For years now, these platforms have acted above the law and outside the reach of regulators and the public, and it's a time for change, in my opinion. The legal protections provided by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act have played a role in that lack of accountability by stopping victims from having their cases heard. In one recently filed suit, a video chatting platform that is commonly used to engage in online sex between users paired a young girl with a middle-aged man. He convinced her to send nude photos and videos of herself, including by blackmailing her. This man forced her to engage in sexual performances for himself and his friends, and even to recruit others. And based on court precedent, Section 230 may very well threaten justice for this young girl. And I hope it does not, because the platform was responsible for pairing the young girl with the middle-aged man. Now, judges and a whole host of diverse interests, including many of our witnesses, have suggested that courts may have interpreted Section 230 more broadly than Congress intended and have urged reform. To be clear, Section 230 is critically important to promoting a vibrant and free internet, but I agree with those who suggest the courts have allowed it to stray too far. Judge Katzmann, the late Chief Judge of the Second Circuit, brought some clarity to this issue in his dissent in Force versus Facebook. He stated that Section 230 does not and should not bar relief when a plaintiff brings a claim that is based not on the content of the information shown, but rather on the connections that platforms' algorithms make between individuals. Of course, that was not the court's ruling in that case, and a challenge for us is to clarify the statute, if the courts don't, while ensuring that we balance the statute's good against the pain it inflicts. So today we'll consider 4 proposals that would amend or clarify Section 230 to protect users while promoting open and free online dialogue. These bills do not impose liability on the platforms and do not directly restrict the content that platforms make available. They simply limit the Section 230 protections in certain circumstances, including when platforms use algorithms to amplify certain content. And these targeted proposals for reform are intended to balance the benefits of vibrant free expression online while ensuring that platforms cannot hide behind Section 230 when their business practices meaningfully contribute to real harm. Now, I have to say I'm disappointed that my Republican colleagues chose not to introduce the discussion drafts they released in July so that they could be included in today's hearing. In order to actually pass legislation that will begin to hold these platforms accountable, we must work together, and I urge my colleagues not to close the door on bipartisanship for an issue that is so critical. Because after all, I believe there is more that unites us than divides us on clarifying Section 230. For example, Ranking Member Rogers' discussion draft includes a provision similar to my Justice Against Malicious Algorithms Act, in that her proposal would clarify that Section 230 immunity does not apply to algorithmic recommendations. While the proposals aren't identical, this is a place for us to start what I hope could be bipartisan work. I just wanted to say one more thing, Mr. Chairman. You know, the real problem I see is that Big Tech's primary focus is to make money. And I know we have a market economy, and that's always a company's primary purpose. But they give the impression to the public that they care about content, values, and have a social purpose, that somehow they care about consumers or the First Amendment, and they have some value to the consumer or to the public. And I hope that continues to be true. But if it is, then they should be held accountable to achieve these goals. You can't go out and say, I'm not primarily focused on making money, I want to help people, but then not be accountable for these bad actions. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mrs. Rogers for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Big tech companies have not been good stewards of their platforms. I've been pretty clear with all the CEOs. Big tech has broken my trust. Big tech has failed to uphold the fundamental American principle, free speech and expression. Big tech platforms like Twitter and Facebook used to provide a promising platform for free speech and robust debates, but they no longer operate as public squares. They do not promote the battle of ideas. They actively work against it. They shut down free speech and censor any viewpoint that does not fit their liberal ideology. And big tech has exploited and harmed our children. In our March hearing with the CEOs, I asked the big tech companies why they deserve liability protections Congress provided for them more than 20 years ago. Unfortunately, their behavior has not improved, and we only have more examples of them being poor stewards of their platforms. Big tech has abused its power by defining what is true, what we should believe, what we should think, and controlling what we need. It's wrong. Destroying free speech is what happens in authoritarian countries, behind the great Chinese firewall. Here in America, we believe in we believe in dialogue. We believe in the battle of ideas. We defend the battle of ideas, and we used to fight to protect our fundamental principles. Rather than censor and silence speech, The answer should be more speech. That's the American way. Big tech should not be the arbiters of truth. Not for me, my community, our children, or any American. Today, we should be focused on solutions that hold big tech accountable for how they censor, allow and promote illegal content, and knowingly endanger our children. It's wrong for anyone to use this opportunity to push for more censorship, more power, and more control over what they determine Americans should say, post, think, and do. Which is why I'm deeply troubled by the path before us. It's calling for more censorship. One of the bills before us today, the Justice Against Malicious Algorithms Act, is a thinly veiled attempt to pressure companies to censor more speech. The proposal will put companies on the hook for any content an algorithm amplifies or recommends that contributes to, quote, severe emotional injury of any person. How does the bill define severe emotional injury? It doesn't. Clearly, companies will have to decide between leaving up content that may offend someone or fight it in court or censor content that reaches a user. Which do you think that they will choose? And there's no doubt who they will silence. Content that does not line up with their liberal ideology. While the Section 230 bill before us today pushes for more censorship, we believe Republicans are fighting for free speech. In January, we rolled out our Big Tech Accountability Platform that made clear we will protect free speech and robust debates on big tech platforms. And we've been working hard since then. Today, we will discuss a number of proposals that reform Section 230. My proposal, which I'm leading along with my good friend, Congressman Jim Jordan, narrowly amends Section 230 to protect free speech. Small businesses and startups will not be impacted by our bill. We remove the largest big tech companies from existing 230 protections and put them under their own set of rules. Under this proposal, big tech will be held accountable for censoring constitutionally protected speech. Big tech will no longer be able to exploit the ambiguity and discretion we see in the current law. Big tech will be more responsible for content that they choose to amplify, promote, or suggest. Big tech will be forced to be transparent about their content decisions, and conservatives will be empowered to challenge big tech's censorship decisions. Amending 230 alone is not enough, which is why we are taking an all-of-the-above approach, which includes increasing transparency and also holding big tech accountable for how they intentionally manipulate and harm children for their own bottom line. While there's agreement on the need to hold big tech accountable with this Section 230 reforms, it's clear there are drastically different approaches and solutions. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. So now I'd like to introduce our witnesses for today's first panel. Ms. Frances Haugen, former Facebook employee, Mr. James Steyer, founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, Ms. Kara Frederick, research fellow in technology policy, Heritage Foundation, and Mr. Rashad Robinson, president of the Color of Change. We want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. I do understand that we will lose Mr. Steyer for about 10 minutes at 11:30, so I would encourage members to be conscious of that. I understand he will be back at 11:40, and of course, members may always submit questions for the record. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Before we begin, I would like to explain the lighting system. In front of our witnesses is a series of lights. The light will initially be green. It will turn yellow when you have a minute remaining. Please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red when your time expires. So let's get started. Ms. Haugen, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Subcommittee Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Lada, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Frances Haugen. I used to work at Facebook. I joined the company because I believe Facebook has the potential to bring out the best in us. But I'm here today because I believe that Facebook's products harm children, stoke division in our communities, threaten our democracy, weaken our national security, and much more. Facebook is a company that is paid for its immense profits with our safety and security. I am honored to be here today to share what I know, and I am grateful for the level of scrutiny these issues are getting. I hope we can stay focused on the real harms to real people rather than talk in abstractions. This is about the teenagers whose mental health is undermined by Instagram, and it is about their parents and teachers who are struggling to deal with the consequences of that harm. It is about the doctors and nurses who have to cope with conspiracies about COVID-19 and vaccines. It is about people who have suffered harassment online. It is about families at home and around the world who live in places where hate, fear, and conflict have been ratcheted up to a fever pitch as a result of online radicalization. Facebook may not be the cause of all these problems, but the company has unquestionably made them worse. Facebook knows what is happening on the platform, and they have systematically underinvested in fighting those harms. They know they do far too little about it. In fact, they have incentives for it to be this way, and that is what has to change. Facebook will not change until the incentives change. The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but they repeatedly chose to ignore these options and continue to put their profits before people. They can change the name of the company, but unless they change the products, they will continue to damage the health and safety of our communities and threaten the integrity of our democracies. There have been many others sounding the same alarm. This committee has heard from many experts in recent years. They have done the painstaking work of documenting these harms and have been repeatedly gaslit by Facebook about what they found. My disclosures back up their findings. We have long known that Facebook's business model is problematic. Now we have the evidence to prove it. The documents I have shared with Congress speak for themselves. What I have to say about these documents is grounded in far more than my experience at Facebook. I have worked as a product manager at large tech companies since 2006, including Google, Pinterest, Yelp, and Facebook. My job has largely focused on algorithmic products like Google Plus Search and recommendation systems like the one that powers Facebook Newsfeed. I know my way around these products, and I have watched them evolve over the many years. Working at 4 major tech companies that operate different types of social networks has given me the perspective to compare and contrast how each company approaches and deals with different challenges. The choices being made by Facebook's leadership are a huge problem for our children, for our communities, and for our democracy. That's why I came forward. And let's be clear, it doesn't have to be this way. They can make different choices. We are here today because of deliberate choices Facebook has made. During my time at the company, first working as the lead product manager for civic misinformation and later on counter-espionage, I saw that Facebook repeatedly encountered conflicts between its own profits and our safety. Management consistently resolved those conflicts in favor of its own profits. I want to be extremely clear. This is not about good ideas or bad ideas, or good people and bad people. Facebook has hidden from you the countless ways to make the platform itself safer so that don't require anyone to pick and choose what ideas are good. But Facebook hid these options from you because the status quo made them more money. We're having a conflict over things that we could solve in other ways that don't compromise speech. Facebook wants you to have analysis paralysis, to get stuck in false choices and not act here. Facebook does not have safety by design, and it chooses every day to run the system hot because it maximizes their profit. The result is a system that amplifies division, extremism, and polarization. Facebook is running the show whether we know it or not. Facebook's choices have led to disastrous ends in too many cases. Facebook's amplification promotes violence that harms and even kills people. In other cases, Facebook's profit-optimizing machine is generating self-harm and self-hate, especially for vulnerable groups like teenage girls, the socially isolated, and the recently widowed. No one is held accountable. These problems have been confirmed repeatedly by Facebook's own internal research, secrets that do not see the light of day. This is not simply a matter of some social media users being angry or unstable. Facebook has made a $1 trillion company by paying for its profits with our safety, including the safety of our children, and that is unacceptable. This committee's attention, this Congress's action are critical. The public deserves further investigation and action to protect customers on several fronts. First, given that platforms like Facebook have become the new cybersecurity attack surface on the United States, our national security demands more oversight. Second, we should be concerned about how Facebook's products are used to influence vulnerable populations. Third, we must correct the broken incentive system that perpetuates consistent misalignment between Facebook's decisions.
Ms. Haugen, you need to wrap up your statement.
Okay. But I'll skip forward. As you consider reforms to Section 230, I encourage you to move forward with your eyes open to the consequences of reform. Congress has instituted carve-outs of Section 230 in recent years. I encourage you to talk to human rights advocates who can help provide context on how the last reform of 230 had dramatic impacts on the safety of some of the most vulnerable people in our society, but has been rarely used for its original purpose. The last thing, they should consult with the international human rights community, who have seen firsthand how authoritarian governments around the world can weaponize reductions in intermediary liability and silence dissent. There is a lot at stake here. You have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to create new rules for our online world. I came forward at great personal risk because I believe we still have time to act, but we must act now. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to try to adhere to the 5-minute rule. This is a very important topic, and so I wanted to give the speakers some leeway, and we'll have time to ask questions. But thank you very much. Mr. Steyer, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Do we have Mr. Steyer remotely? Please,
thank you very much.
There we go.
Chairman, there you go. Thank you very much, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Rogers, and Ranking Member Latta, and all the distinguished subcommittee members. This is really a privilege and an honor to testify in front of you today. I am James P. Steyer. I'm the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, the nation's leading children's media and nonpartisan advocacy organization. As many of you know, we have well over 100 million unique users, over 110,000 member schools, definitely in all of your districts. And we are a nonpartisan, powerful voice for kids and families here in this country. And the fact that you're having this hearing is actually remarkable and important. The other thing I would say is I'm the father of 4 kids, so I've lived through, over the past 20 years, the evolution of this extraordinary tech society that we've all lived through. And over the last nearly 2 years, the pandemic, where my kids have been going to school online and in distance learning. So as a parent, I see these issues. And I'd also mention, because I know the First Amendment will come up, that I've been a professor at Stanford for over 30 years teaching First Amendment law. So I'd be happy to speak to some of those issues as well as they intersect with some of the 230 issues. 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Talking Back to Facebook. The heads of the company at that point that Ms. Haugen just spoke about literally threatened to block the publication of the book. Part of the reason was there was a chapter in there about girls' and boys' body image and the impact of social media platforms on body image. And obviously, 10 years ago, the heads of that company, who I have met with repeatedly, knew that there were issues. And so when Frances Haugen came forward recently to talk about additional research that they know, it merely just shows you that not just Facebook, but all of the major tech companies are aware of the impact of their platforms on our society. The key is we are now at a watershed moment. And you have mentioned this in your opening statements, but it is true. We have literally been over a decade without major reforms for these companies. And we've assumed that in some cases they would self-police or self-regulate. Well, that's not true. And the record is clear. So the bipartisan leadership of this committee could not be more important and could not come at a more important time. And I would argue that in the next 3 to 6 months, the most important legislation, including some of the legislation that this subcommittee is considering today, will move forward and will finally put the guardrails on that America's children and families deserve. We all know that kids and teens are uniquely vulnerable online because their brains are still developing. They are prone to oversharing. They're not equipped to think through all the consequences of what they do, and they're spending more time online than ever before. So even though kids get a tremendous amount of benefits from the internet and from social media platforms, it's absolutely clear that we have to regulate them thoughtfully and carefully. And the moment is nigh, and Congress has a responsibility to kids and families in this country to act. My written testimony will give you more examples, but just a handful of details that I think we should all remember when we think about the impact of social media platforms on kids and families, and therefore the relevance of Section 230 and other laws. First, platforms drag kids down rabbit holes. They have led to issues like eating disorders, body dysmorphia, suicide ideation, and more. We could tell you stories, as some of our opening statements, as some of you have done your opening statements, of individual kids who've committed suicide or gone through extraordinary challenges as a result of these platforms and their harmful content. They literally feed off teens' desire to be accepted through their likes and their follows, and they enable sometimes harmful comment virally. So the bottom line is you have this bipartisan consensus with well over 100 million members. Common sense is out there in the field every day talking to families. This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democratic issue. This is an American family issue. And you have the opportunity to do something very, very important now, and this is the time to act. Look, Ms. Haugen talked about the ways in which Facebook has acted with impunity for decades. Reforming Section 230 is clearly one big piece of the puzzle. But I would add that there must be a more comprehensive approach. You cannot just deal with Section 230. We also have to deal with privacy issues and other related issues. They're all one big comprehensive package. So the hearing next week will also be critically important. And passing revised COPPA and the KIDS Act and other things will matter. The bottom line is our kids and our families' well-being is at stake. You have the power to improve that and change that. The moment is here. Bless you for taking this on, and let's move forward together on a bipartisan basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Steyer. Chair now recognizes Ms. Frederick for 5 minutes.
Chairs Doyle and Pallone, Ranking Members Lotta and McMorris-Rogers, distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I, too, used to work at Facebook. I joined the company after 3 tours in Afghanistan, helping Special Operations Forces target al-Qaeda, because I believed in Facebook's mission as well, the democratization of information. But I was wrong. It's 2021, and the verdict is in. Big tech is an enemy of the people. It is time all independently minded citizens recognize this. So what makes this moment different? Traditional gatekeepers of information, corporate media, the academy, various organs of the culture are captured by the left. As the past year has borne out, big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon are not afraid to exercise their power in the service of this ideology. Big tech companies, they tell us not to believe our lying eyes, that viewpoint censorship is all in our heads. Tell that to the Gold Star mom who criticized Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal and was deleted by Facebook after the death of her son, a US Marine. Tell that to Allie Beth Stuckey, who had the temerity to say that biological men should not compete in women's sports before being suspended by Twitter. Tell that to Clarence Thomas, whose documentary on Amazon was deleted without explanation. Beyond these examples, which are legion, the confluence of evidence is irrefutable. Twitter and Facebook censor Republican members of Congress at a rate of 53-1 compared to Democrats. Twitter suspends conservatives 21 times more often than liberals. Facebook created 2 internal tools in the aftermath of Trump's 2016 victory that suppressed right-wing content, media traffic, and reach on its platform. Google stifled conservative-leaning outlets like the Daily Caller, Breitbart, and The Federalist during the 2020 election season, with Breitbart's search visibility shrinking by 99% compared to the 2016 election cycle. Apple dumped the conservative-friendly Parler app as it sat atop its App Store. Google and Amazon Web Services did so as well. And these practices have distinct political effects. The Media Research Center found in 2020 that 1 in 6 Biden voters claimed they would have modified their vote had they been aware of information that was actively suppressed by tech companies. 52% of Americans believe social media suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story constituted election interference. These practices erode our culture of free speech chill open discourse, and engender self-censorship. All while the Taliban, the Chinese Communist Party, and Iranian officials spew their bile and genocidal rhetoric on American-owned platforms. Big tech is also working hand in glove with the government to do its bidding. Jen Psaki admitted from the White House podium that the government is communicating with Facebook to single out accounts and posts for censorship. And that's just what she admitted out loud. The outlook is grim. A lack of accountability and the sweeping immunity conferred on big tech by broad interpretations of Section 230 has emboldened these companies to abuse their concentrations of power, constrict the digital lives of those who express specific political views, and sharpen digital surveillance on ordinary Americans. Just look at Apple's now paused plans to scan the content directly on your personal device, starting with iPhotos. Put simply, big tech companies are not afraid of the American people, and they're not afraid of meaningful checks on their abuse of power. And it shows. Yet we should be wary of calls to further suppress content based on politically expedient definitions of misinformation. Clearly, this definition is in the eye of the beholder. The Wuhan lab leak theory comes to mind. So let the whistleblower docs speak for themselves. Holding big tech accountable should result in less censorship, not more. In fact, the First Amendment should be the standard from which all Section 230 reforms flow. Despite what the new Twitter CEO might think, American lawmakers have a duty to protect and defend the rights given to us by God and enshrined in our Constitution by the founders. Rights that specific tech companies, in conjunction with the government, are actively and deliberately eroding. The argument that private companies do not bear free speech responsibilities ignores overt collaboration between the government and big tech companies working together to stifle free expression. Most importantly, Section 230 reform is not a silver bullet. We have to look outside of DC for answers. States, civil societies, and tech founders all have a role to play here. We cannot let tech totalitarians shape a digital world where one set of thinkers are second-class citizens. The window of opportunity to do something is closing.
Thank you, Ms. Frederick. Chair now recognizes Mr. Robinson for 5 minutes.
Chair Pallone, Chair Doyle, Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, Ranking Member Latta, thank you for having me here today. I am Rashad Robinson, President of Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization. I also co-chaired the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder, which just released our comprehensive set of recommendations for effectively tackling misinformation and disinformation. I want to thank this committee and its leaders for your work, introducing the Justice Against Malicious Algorithm Act, the Safe Tech Act, the Civil Rights Modernization Act, and the Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act. Each one is essential for reducing the tech industry's harmful effects on our lives. Congress is rightly called to major action when an industry's business model is at odds with the public interest, when it generates its greatest profits only by causing the greatest harms. Big tech corporations like Facebook, Amazon, and Google maintain near total control over all three areas of online life: online commerce, online content, and online social connection. To keep control, they lie about the effects of their products, just like big tobacco lies about the deaths their products cause. They lie to the public, they lie to regulators, and they lie to you. Mark Zuckerberg lied to me personally more than once. It's time to make the truth louder than their lies, but skip the part where we wait 40 years to do it. The most important first step is something we have more control over than we think, and that is drawing a bright, clear line between fake solutions and real solutions. Big tech would love for Congress to pass laws that mimic their own corporate policies. Fake solutions that are ineffective, designed to protect nothing more than their profits and their power. And we can't let that happen. We know it's a fake solution if we're letting them blame the victims by shifting the burden of solving these problems to consumers, because consumer literacy or use of technology is not the problem. The problem is corporations' design of technology, and that is what we need to regulate. If we're pretending that colorblind policies will solve problems that have everything to do with race, because algorithms, advertisers, moderators, and bad advertisers are targeting Black people, and we don't get closer to the solution by backing away from that problem. If we're putting trust in anything big tech corporations say, because it's a lie that self-regulation is anything other than complete non-regulation, and it's a lie that this is about free speech, when the real issue is regulating deceptive and manipulative content, consumer exploitation, calls to violence, and discriminatory products. Section 230 is not here to nullify 60 years of civil rights and consumer safety law, no matter what any billionaire from Silicon Valley comes here to tell you. There are 3 ways to know we are heading towards real solutions. Laws and regulations must be crystal clear. Big tech corporations are responsible and liable for the damages and violations of people's rights, and that they not only enable, but outright encourage. That requires well-vetted and targeted amendments to Section 230. You're responsible for what you sell. Big tech corporations sell content. That is their main product. Congress must allow judges, juries, regulators, and government enforcers to do their jobs, to determine what's hurting people and stop it, and hold the responsible parties liable. Responsibility without accountability isn't responsibility at all. Congress must enable proper enforcement. I want to applaud this committee for ensuring that the Build Back Better legislation includes funding for the FTC. The next step is making sure the FTC hires staff with true civil rights expertise. Laws and regulations must be crystal clear. Big tech products must be subject to regulatory scrutiny and approval before they're released onto the public and hurt people. Just like a drug formula should be approved by the FDA, tech products need to pass inspection, an independent auditing process that exposes what they would like to hide. But regulators can't fall for shifting the burden and blame to consumers. The lie that we simply need to put more control in the hands of users is like stacking our supermarket shelves with poison and expiring food and then saying we are simply giving consumers more choice. Finally, Congress must take antitrust action seriously with big tech. Ending their massive concentration of power is a necessary condition to ending the major damage they cause. The right approach is not complicated if we make the internet safe for those who are being hurt the most. It automatically makes the system safe for everyone. And that is why I am here. Because big tech puts Black people and people of color in danger more than anyone else. Passing and enforcing laws that guarantee freedom and safety for Black people in online commerce, content, and social connection will create the safest internet for the largest number of people. You can make technology the vehicle for progress that it should be, and no longer the threat to freedom, fairness, and safety it has become. Do not allow the technology that is supposed to take us into the future drag us into the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. We've concluded our openings. We now move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Haugen, last week, the Washington Post reported that Facebook knew the structure of its algorithms was allowing hateful content targeting predominantly Black, Muslim, LGBTQ, and Jewish communities. Facebook knew it could take steps with its algorithm to lessen the reach of such harmful content while still leaving the content up on their website, but they declined to do so. This appears to be a clear case where Facebook knew its own actions would cause hateful, harmful content to spread and took those actions anyway. I would also note that when Mr. Zuckerberg testified before us earlier this year, he bragged about the steps his company took to reduce the spread of hateful content. Shamefully, he left this known information out of his testimony. Ms. Haugen, setting law aside, do you think Facebook has a moral duty to reduce this type of content on its platform, and do you believe they've lived up to that moral duty?
I believe Facebook has a moral duty to be transparent about the operation of its algorithms and the performance of those systems. Currently, they operate in the dark because they know that with no transparency, there is no accountability. I also believe that once someone knows a harm exists and they know that they are causing that harm, they do have a duty to address it. Facebook has known since 2018 that changes they made to their algorithm in order to get people to produce more content, i.e. the change from goaling on time spent to meaningful social interactions, increased the amount of extreme and polarizing content on the platform. I can't speak to that specific example because I don't know the exact circumstances of it, but Facebook knew that they were giving the most reach, the most offensive content And I want to give you a very specific example on those. Let's imagine you encountered a piece of content that was actively defaming a group that you belong to. It could be Christians, it could be Muslims, it could be anyone. If that post causes controversy in the comments, it will get blasted out to those people's friends, even if they didn't follow that group. And so the most offensive content, the most extreme content, gets the most distribution.
Yeah. Turning to Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, can you tell the committee in plain words how teen girls are being harmed by the content they see on that platform, and how decisions of Instagram led to this harm?
Facebook's internal research states that not only is Instagram dangerous for teenagers, it's actually substantially more dangerous than other social media platforms, because TikTok is about performance and doing things with your friends. Snapchat is largely about augmented reality and faces, but Instagram is about bodies and social comparison. Teenagers are very vulnerable to social comparison. They're going through a phase of their lives where there's a lot of things changing. And what Facebook's own research says is that when kids fall down these rabbit holes, when the algorithm finds, like, you start from something like healthy eating and it pushes you towards anorexia content, you have the perfect storm where kids are put in vulnerable environments and then given the most extreme content.
Yeah. Mr. Robinson, it's disappointing, if not surprising, to hear the lack of action on the part of Facebook after your negotiations with Mr. Zuckerberg. And I share your concern, what you discussed in your testimony, that highlights how not just the advertisers, but the platforms themselves can perpetuate discrimination. Can you discuss how you think targeted amendments to Section 230 can address some of the actions of the big platforms?
Well, right now, we are all in this situation where we have to go to Facebook and ask for their benevolence in dealing with the harms on their platforms. Going to billionaires where every single day their incentive structure is growth and profit over safety, integrity, and security. And so we've done this before with other industries. Congress has done this before in this country with other industries, where we create rules that actually hold them accountable. And right now, whether it is their product design on what they recommend and what they lead you to, or it is in the paid advertisement and content, Facebook is completely not accountable. And the other thing that I think is incredibly important is that they believe that they do not have to adhere to civil rights law. They've said that before Congress, they've said that to us, and the idea that we are going to allow Silicon Valley companies and their lawyers to come here and say that there are some laws that they are accountable and some laws they are not is outrageous. And I think that those targeted amendments to Section 230 both allow for free speech to exist, which as any civil rights leader in this country will tell you that we value and believe in free speech, while also having accountability for things that are absolutely not about free speech.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I will now yield to Mr. Latta, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Haugen, I could start my questioning with you. The documents you brought forward from your time at Facebook show that Facebook has intentionally misled the public about the research they have conducted about the impacts of their platforms, including the mental health of children. We've heard from the big tech companies, including Facebook, talk to us about how amending Section 230 will cause them to leave content up or take content down, depending on who they are speaking to. You spoke in your testimony about how Facebook puts its profits over people. If that is the case, how do you think Facebook would adapt to Section 230 reform, where they would be held liable for certain content on its platform?
Facebook has tried to reduce this discussion to the idea of, are we taking down enough content, are we leaving up too much content, that kind of thing. When in reality, they have lots and lots of ways to make the platform safer, product choices designed in the algorithm, where it's not about picking good or bad ideas, it's about making sure that the most extreme polarizing ideas don't get the most reach. I don't know exactly how Facebook would adapt to 230 reform, but I believe that in a world where making a series of intentional choices to prioritize growth and running the system hot over having safer options, I would hope that pattern of behavior would be held accountable.
Well, thank you. Ms. Frederick, you are a former Facebook employee and have done significant research on how these platforms censor content, including political speech, which they disagree. The platforms claim they do not censor based on political viewpoint. What's your response to that?
My response is, believe your lying eyes. Tech companies, they're not neutral gatekeepers of information. You can see the sourcing in my testimony of the litany of examples and new research that I went over in my opening testimony testifies to exactly what they're doing and how skewed it is against viewpoint, or big tech companies are against viewpoints. Talk to Senator Rand Paul, talk to Reverend Carl Truman, talk to Governor Ron DeSantis, talk to Steven Crowder, talk to Dr. Scott Atlas, talk to the Gold Star mom, talk to Jim Banks, talk to Jenna Ellis, talk to Ali Beth Stuckey, talk to Mike Gonzalez, talk to Ryan T. Anderson. All of these American citizens have been victimized by these tech companies and by viewpoint censorship. So when tech companies say, look away, this is not actually happening, I say, believe your lying eyes.
Thank you. Let me continue, Ms. Frederick. As part of the Big Tech Accountability Platform, I've offered draft legislation that would amend Section 230 to narrow liability protection for platforms that promote or facilitate content that the platform knew or had reason to believe violated federal criminal law. In short, if a platform is acting as a bad Samaritan, they would not receive Section 230 liability protection in those instances. How do you think, or what do you think about the impacts that this legislation would have if it would be enacted in the law?
My thoughts are that you strip immunity when it's being abused. So if the abuses of this immunity continue, then you get rid of it. You get rid of the freedom from civil liabilities when it is being abused by these tech companies. It's as simple as that.
You know, let me go back to your testimony because, you know, when you were talking, I believe it was 52 to 53 to 1 when it was conservatives to maybe liberal viewpoints. How, you know, if this is presented to the big tech companies out there, what's the response that you hear from them on that?
So I think people try to cover their rear ends in a lot of ways, but I think Americans are waking up.
Okay, can I ask you real quick, how are they covering themselves?
I'm sorry?
How are they covering themselves?
By saying that we don't do this, by employing an army of lobbyists in DC that say we don't do this, that it's all in your head, by denying reality and what people who use these platforms actually see happening for the suppression of political viewpoints. There's a high level of tech company apologists who come into these doors, sit at these daises and say, this is not happening, don't believe it, but we have the concrete information to say that, yes, this is actually happening. You have the Media Research Center, which is acting as a lion in this regard to actually get the numbers and make sure that these viewpoint censorship instances are quantified. A lot of people, especially independent research organizations, partisan research organizations, don't want to see that actually happen and that information get out there, so they smear the source. But now I think there's stuff leaking through the cracks, and this is going to eventually get bigger and bigger and become a more prodigious movement, and we need to ensure and support the sources that actually do that.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, the full committee chairman, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. In our March hearing, I asked Mark Zuckerberg about whether he was aware of the company's internal research showing that his company's algorithms were recommending that its users join fringe extremist groups in Europe and here in large numbers. And reporting from the Wall Street Journal indicated that Mr. Zuckerberg failed to fully implement corrective measures his employees pushed for internally because it could have undermined advertising revenue. Back to profit again. So, Ms. Haugen, this seems like a pattern of behavior. So in your view, what are the most compelling examples of the company ignoring threats to users in the name of profits?
Facebook has known since 2018 that that the choices that they made around the design of the newsfeed algorithm were, while increasing the amount of content consumed, increasing the length of sessions, that it was providing hyper-amplification for the worst ideas. I'll give you an example. Groups, like most people think Facebook is about your family and friends. Facebook has pushed people more and more aggressively towards large groups because it lengthens your session, right? If we had a Facebook that was like what we had in 2008, you know, it's about your family and friends, for free, you would get less hate speech, less nudity, less violence. But Facebook would make less money because your family and friends don't produce enough content for you to look at 2,000 pieces of content a day. Facebook has implemented policies like if you are invited to a group, even if you don't accept it, you will begin to receive content from that group for 30 days. And if you engage with any of it, it will be considered a follow. In a world where the algorithms pick the most extreme content from these mega groups and distribute it, that kind of behavior directly is Facebook promoting their profits over our safety.
Robinson, light went back on. The internet and social media platforms have made it easier for civil rights groups and racial justice groups like Color of Change to organize around vitally important issues. However, you firmly demonstrated in your testimony how the current practices of these platforms have harmed Black and marginalized communities. So my question is, as we work to refine the proposals before us, can you describe how my bill, the Justice Against Malicious Algorithms Act, will help protect Black and marginalized voices online?
Great. Well, first of all, you have a bill, so thank you, because I think that has been incredibly important, is moving towards action. But your bill removes liability for content information provided through personalized algorithms, or algorithms that are specifically tailored to specific individuals. And that essentially has been sort of one of the problems. It's doing something that, we can't wait. We've seen Facebook allow advertisers to exclude Black people from housing, exclude women from jobs, creating these sort of personalized algorithms that give people experiences that actually take us outside of hard-won and hard-fought victories we've had around laws, dragging us from the 21st century back to the 1950s. And your bill, as well as other pieces of legislation that are before this committee, hold these institutions accountable to not be immune to a whole set of laws and standards that every single other business in this country has to adhere to.
Thank you. Let me ask you another question. Some defenders of Section 230 say that changes to the law will result in a deluge of frivolous lawsuits against platforms, big and small. So I wanted to ask you, would reforming Section 230, in your opinion, even if that results in increased lawsuits, hurt or harm marginalized communities and smaller or nonprofit websites that do good work?
Giving everyday people access and opportunity to hold big institutions accountable is part of this country's fabric, being able to give people the opportunity to raise their voices and push back. And right now, what we have is big companies, huge multinational companies. Facebook has nearly 3 billion users. That is more followers than Christianity. And for us to say that we shouldn't be able to hold them accountable, that we shouldn't be able to push back against them, is an outrageous statement. And so yes, there will be more lawsuits. There will be more accountability. But that means that there will hopefully be changes to the structures and the way that they do business. Just like the toys you will be giving to the children in your family this holiday season have to be accountable before they get to the shelves because of lawsuits, because of accountability. We need these companies to be accountable. And so there will be a trade-off. But as someone who's gone back and forth in the room with Mark Zuckerberg, with Jack, with Sheryl Sandberg, and all of these people have tried for years to get them to actually not only move new policies to be more accountable, but then to actually implement them and enforce them, we cannot allow them to continue to self-regulate themselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mrs. Rogers, full committee ranking member, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Haugen, I wanted to start with a yes or no question. Do you support big tech's censorship of constitutionally protected speech on their platforms?
Do I support? What do you define as censorship?
Censorship, them controlling what is constitutionally protected speech under the First Amendment.
I am a strong proponent of re-architecting these systems so that they are more focused on our family and friends, because this is not about good ideas or bad ideas. It is about making the system safer.
The question is, yes or no, do you support them censoring constitutionally protected speech under the First Amendment?
I believe that we should have things like fact checks included along with content. I think the current system...
I guess I take it as a no.
I think there are better solutions than censorship that we should be using.
Okay, Ms. Frederick, obviously, many Americans have lost trust with big tech. And it's because they are arbitrarily censoring speech that they don't agree with. And it seems like the censorship is in one direction. It's against the conservative content. So as we think about solutions as to how we're going to hold big tech accountable, we absolutely have to be thoughtful about bringing transparency and accountability. I wanted to ask you to talk about the difference between misinformation and disinformation.
Are we talking about these differences in a sane world? Because in a sane world, disinformation would be the intentional propagation of misleading or false information, and misinformation would just be false information that sort of spreads on these platforms. But now we know that both of these terms are being conflated into a catch-all for information that the left doesn't like. So a perfect example of this is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, when in the early days of the pandemic, Tom Cotton floated this theory and people thought he's a deranged conspiracy theorist. We have to suppress this information. Big tech actively suppressed mentions of the Wuhan lab leak theory. Now it's part of acceptable discourse. The New Yorker gets to talk about it, the Wall Street Journal talks about it. Okay, we can talk about it again. When Tom Cotton was very much onto something in the beginning. And then you look at the same thing, the Hunter Biden laptop story. This is from the New York Post, incriminating Hunter Biden and his relationship with Ukraine, et cetera, and Joe Biden as well. And the New York Post, and Facebook and Twitter, we have proof of this, actively suppressed links to that information. They didn't allow people to actually click on this story. So you have high-level intelligence community officials, I'm talking the highest level of the US intelligence community, saying that the Hunter Biden laptop story bore all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation, and tech companies were completely in tandem with those decisions. Now, Hunter Biden goes on TV, doesn't deny that the laptop is his. Politico even confirmed the story.
Yep. Thank you. Would you speak to concerns around the government regulating misinformation?
This is huge. And in July, Jen Psaki and the Surgeon General, they got up on the podium, they spoke from the White House with the imprimatur of the state, and they said, we are directly communicating with Facebook, and we have pointed out specific posts, specific accounts that we want them to take off the platform. Within a month, all of those accounts and those users, those posts, 12 of them, in fact, were gone. CNN gloated about it later. So when the government works with these big tech companies to stifle speech, you have a problem, and you have a First Amendment problem in that regard. The difference between tech companies and the government policing speech is elided when that happens.
So I've been working on some legislation with Jim Jordan, and what it proposes is that it would remove those Section 230 protections for big tech when they are taking down the constitutionally protected speech. It also sunsets the new provisions in 5 years. The goal here is for them to have to earn the liability protections. So do you believe that this would be an effective way to hold them accountable and prevent this censorship?
I think tech always outpaces attempts to govern it. The sunset clause is a great idea. We advocated for it at the Heritage Foundation, so definitely a good idea. Allow time for us to redress some of the imbalance between these big tech companies and the users, the American people, by letting us legislate on it. And we shouldn't be afraid to legislate on it.
Thank you. I'm quickly running out of time, Ms. Haugen. I have significant concerns about the impact on our youth, on the young generation, on children, and just would you speak briefly about Facebook and their internal models' impact on mental health of children and how it alters their business model? And I'm out of time.
Yeah. Facebook knows the future of growth on the platform is children. That's why they're pushing into things like Instagram Kids, even though they know that the rates of problematic use are highest in their youngest users. It's because the younger you are, the less your brain is formed. Facebook also knows that kids are suffering alone right now because their parents didn't live through this experience of addictive software when they were youths. And kids end up getting advice like, why don't you just not use it? Not understanding how addictive these platforms are. I think the fact that Facebook knows that kids are suffering alone and that their products are actively contributing to this is a problem. And the fact that they lied to Congress repeatedly about these harms is unacceptable. So I hope that you guys act because our children deserve something better.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chair. I thank the witnesses for this testimony. Ms. Haugen, I had to leave a company for bad policies, and it was painful, so I appreciate what you've gone through. You've discussed 2018 change, and this has been discussed already in this committee, the company made to its algorithms to favor meaningful social interactions, also known as MSIs. This change was made to increase engagement based on my understanding that it continues to favor content that is more likely to be shared by others. The problem is that Facebook research found that MSI rewarded provocative and negative content of low quality and promoted spread of divisive content. Facebook executives rejected changes suggested by employees that would have countered this. So how difficult is it for Facebook to change its algorithms to lessen the impact of that?
Facebook knows that individual factors within meaningful social interactions, and I want to be clear, hate speech and bullying is considered meaningful as a social interaction in most languages in the world.
Sure.
And Facebook knows that there are individual terms within that algorithm that if you remove them, you instantly get substantially less misinformation, substantially less nudity. And Facebook has intentionally chosen not to remove those factors because it would decrease their profits. So yes, they could do a change tomorrow that would give us 25% less misinformation.
So that was going to be my next question, is why wouldn't they do that? But it's obviously because they want to.
Actually, I want a slight tweak. They claim they did it because they wanted people to engage more, that they wanted it to be more meaningful. But when they checked 6 months later, people said their home feeds or their news feeds were less meaningful. And I want it on the record, they didn't do this because they wanted us to engage. They did it because it made us produce more content. That the only thing they found that could get us to produce more things was giving us more little hits of dopamine in the form of likes, comments, and reshares.
So are there other problematic design choices the company is making today that would increase profits and increase proliferation of harmful content?
Facebook knows that people who are suffering from extreme loneliness, isolation, are often the ones that form very intense habits involving usage. We're talking about thousands of pieces of content per day. You could imagine simple things that said, are you going down a rabbit hole? Are you spending 10 hours a day on the system? Often when people get depressed or experience other things, they self-soothe. Like we see this with children all the time. Facebook could acknowledge this pattern and put a little bit of friction in to decrease these kinds of things, and it would help the most vulnerable users on the platform. But it would decrease their profits.
Thank you. Mr. Robinson, your stark testimony details the harm the lack of tech platform accountability has had on marginalized communities, such as some of my communities. In your testimony, you state that Facebook is not just a tool of discrimination by businesses, but Facebook's own algorithms are drivers of this discrimination. Can you talk more about how the algorithms created and implemented by the platform, including Facebook, leads to discrimination?
Absolutely. Well, you know, Facebook's algorithms, especially the personalized algorithms, allow for a whole set of ways that people are excluded from opportunities or over-included in opportunities and over-included and over-recommended into sharing, leading people down sort of deep rabbit holes or cutting people off from housing opportunities, job opportunities, and everything else. And they've said, you know, I remember a conversation where we were trying to deal with housing and job employment discrimination on their platform. There was a lawsuit against Facebook that they eventually settled, but never took all the way to the courts because they essentially want to be able to keep 230 protections in place. And the back and forth with Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg about both of those cases, they said to us deeply, we care about civil rights. You know, we care about these issues. It pains us deeply that our platform is causing these harms, and we're going to work to fix it. And so they settled the case. And then research comes out just a couple months later that the same thing is continuing to happen after they've told us and they've told you that it's no longer happening on their platform. I sat across from Mark Zuckerberg and specifically talked to him about voter suppression on their platform, only to work with them to get policies in place, then to watch them while they then don't enforce those policies. We've sat in the room with them on multiple occasions, and I have to just say time and time again that there is no other place that these changes are going to happen if it does not happen here.
Thank you. Very good answers. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Guthrie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it very much. And we're all concerned about misinformation and don't want misinformation spread on the internet. The question is, how do you define misinformation? Who gets to define it? And Ms. Frederick, I'll ask the question of you, but first I want to set up the question. You kind of set it up earlier with the Wuhan lab. I'm the ranking member of the healthcare subcommittee, and we've been really looking into the Wuhan lab. And I just want to set up, this isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is a real scenario of information getting blocked from Facebook. And it goes to some of the comments, and I've got documentation here. If you go back to the April 17th White House press briefing, somebody asked the president, and I want to ask Dr. Fauci, could you address the suggestions or concerns that the virus is somehow man-made, possibly came out of a laboratory in China? The president says, want to go, and so Dr. Fauci said, there was a study recently that we can make available to you where a group of highly qualified evolutionary biologists looked at the sequences there and the sequences in bats as they evolve and the mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now totally consistent with the jump of a species from an animal to a human. So disregarding the lab. So Peter Daszak sent an email the next day to Dr. Fauci as the PI of the R01 grant publicly targeted by Fox News. Now, this grant was where Echo Health Systems was being paid by taxpayer dollars to go to caves in China and harvest viruses from bats that may never see a human being, and then taking them to a city of 11 million people, Wuhan, taking 11 million people. But he said to Dr. Fauci, as the PI of the R01 grant publicly targeted by Fox reporters at the presidential press briefing last night, I just wanted to say a personal thank you on behalf of our staff and collaborators. This is from public information you could FOIA. I want our staff for publicly standing up and stating that the scientific evidence supports a natural origin for COVID-19 from a bat to human spillover, not a lab release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. From my perspective, your comments are brave and coming from your trusted voice. You help dispel the myths being spun around the virus origins. In the return email from Dr. Fauci, Peter, many thanks for your kind note. Best regards, Tony. So I say that because we had, who's going to determine what's misinformation or not? Here's the National Institutes of Health that we have funded tremendously over the last few years. We all had a lot of faith and trust in, dismissing that it came from the Wuhan lab when there was no evidence to dismiss it. Absolutely, the evidence doesn't exist today. It didn't exist at the time to say that it couldn't have come from the lab. I had a conversation last spring with Dr. Collins and brought this up and was really concerned about a lot of faith in what these guys did. And matter of fact, I quoted Dr. Fauci on this when people say this came from Wuhan. Like, oh, we have virologists saying that it didn't, because we've had these before our committee and had no reason to not believe what they said. And when I talked with Dr. Collins, and if somebody wants to ask him to see if this is an accurate description of a phone call, I'll certainly welcome somebody to do that. But essentially, I said I'm disappointed in where it's coming because I've looked at a lot of evidence, and it really appears this could have come possibly, very more likely than not, through the lab. And he goes, well, it did originate in nature, so it's not man-made, originated in nature. Now, if it went to a bat to a human, from bat to a mammal to a human, or bat to the lab or to the human, because it got leaked through the lab, we can't rule that out. So we're talking about that people will be calling myths, talking conspiracies, whatever, and the whole time they never could rule it out. And the reason it's relevant to this hearing is because Facebook took down, and I got to hear, any comments that it came from the Wuhan lab, man-made in the Wuhan lab. And on May 26th, I need to look at the dates I talked to Dr. Collins, it's pretty close. In light of the ongoing, Facebook posted, in light of the ongoing investigations of the origin of COVID-19, and in consultation with public health experts, we will no longer remove the claim that COVID-19 is man-made or manufactured. So my point is, we've got the top scientists at NIH, people that a lot of us had faith in and quoted, and now that regret that I quoted them to constituents who brought these things to my attention. And now we know that what they were saying, if you look at sparse the words, they might be saying the truth, but it wasn't accurate in terms of could it have somehow, the Wuhan lab was involved in moving forward. Now the preponderance evidence that it is. So Ms. Frederick, the question I have is, how did the social media platforms fail in this? And then who do we look to for expertise if we're gonna try to well, I've used all my time, so you won't be able to answer, but how are we going to define what misinformation is and who gets to define that? Those are the questions we're going to have to address as we move forward, and I yield back. Thank you.
Was there a question there? Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Clark for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and let me start by thanking Chairman Dole and Chairman Pallone for calling this very important hearing. I'd also like to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today to discuss accountability in tech, examining the harm done by the current governing rules governing the internet, and exploring targeted reforms to ensure that the rules and regulations which initially created the conditions necessary for internet use to flourish and to grow are not outdated in the face of the technological advances made this century. Under the leadership of Chairman Pallone and Doyle, this committee has worked for years to better understand and limit the spread of harmful content on social media platforms, and now is the time for action. As many social media platforms have moved away from chronological ranking to a more targeted user experience, the use of algorithmic amplification has become increasingly widespread while remaining opaque to users and policymakers alike. This use of algorithmic amplification has far too often resulted in discriminatory outcomes and the promotion of harmful content. The lack of transparency into how algorithms are used, coupled with big tech's increasing dominance in the world of online advertising and commerce, have seemingly incentivized business models that rely on discriminatory practices and the promotion of harmful content. My first question is for Mr. Robinson. You touched on this a bit in your written testimony, but could you expound on how this combination of a lack of transparency in an industry dominated by a few major players has been detrimental to communities of color, and how my legislation, the Civil Rights Modernization Act, would help?
Absolutely. Well, your piece of legislation, Congresswoman, takes away liability shield claims when it comes to targeted advertising. And that's incredibly important because, as I've already stated, what we end up having is these companies creating all sorts of loopholes and backdoors to get around civil rights law. And in essence, creating an incredibly hostile environment. When it comes to the amplification of hate, big tech is profiting off of yelling fire in a crowded theater. And so I understand that we have these conversations about the First Amendment, but there are limitations to what you can and cannot say. And right now, the incentive structures and the business models of big tech, the recommendations, what they amplify and what they choose to amplify. In a conversation with Mark Zuckerberg about dealing with the deep impact of census disinformation on his platform, we were trying to have a conversation about a set of policies they could have put in place to deal with census disinformation. Mark decided to bring up a young woman, a young dreamer that he mentors in East Palo Alto, and told the story of her being a DACA recipient. And he was afraid that if he limited in some way census disinformation, that it would limit her from being able to express concern given the challenges that happened around DACA. My response was, well, what other decisions does this young woman get to make at Facebook? And is she putting millions of dollars behind her post? Because if she's not putting millions of dollars behind her post, then in fact, maybe her friends won't even see it on the platform. But this is essentially what we're dealing with, and this is why we're before Congress. Because at the end of the day, self-regulated companies are unregulated companies. And Facebook and their billionaires will continue to put their hands on the scale of injustice as long as it makes them more money. And only Congress can stop them from doing it. And Congress has done this before in the past when it comes to other companies which have harmed and hurt us, and that's why we're here.
Thank you. Mr. Steyer, your testimony focused on many of the negative impacts of algorithmic amplification and prolonged screen time on children and young people. This is something I'm very concerned about, particularly because we cannot yet fully understand the long-term impact as the children of today grow into leaders of tomorrow. Can you please explain for the committee how companies use Section 230 protections to continue these dangerous practices?
Sure, and I think that Ms. Haugen has actually also referenced that, Congresswoman Clark. And the truth is this, because of the fact, and we're using Facebook as an example, but don't forget there are other social media platforms that act similarly. Because they focus completely on engagement and attention, this is really an arms race for attention. What happens is kids are basically become addicted to the screen because of the design techniques. Actually, Congresswoman Schakowsky can have a hearing next week about it. But the bottom line is they are trying to, the business model encourages engagement and a constant attention. And that is very damaging to children because it means they spend more and more time in front of a screen. And that is not a healthy thing. So that is the fundamental business model that leads to the focus on attention and engagement that is damaging to children. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kinzinger for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. This hearing is important and timely. I find the underlying subject is growing, tiring at the same time. We ask social media companies nicely to change their operations for the public good. We hold hearings. We warn of major legislative and regulatory changes, and nothing gives. They nibble around the edges from time to time, usually when major news stories break, but things continue to get worse over time and not better, which is why I've been working for years now to find reasonable and equitable policy solutions. In recent years, my approach has been to avoid amending Section 230 because I felt that we should be considering other options first. So I introduced 2 bills, Social Media Accountability and Account Verification Act and the Social Media Fraud Mitigation Act, both narrow in scope and don't amend 230. It would have had the FTC undertake a narrow rulemaking to require more action from social media companies to investigate complaints about deceptive accounts and fraudulent activity on their platform, and I believe they strike a good balance. They would have a positive impact on consumer protection without making drastic policy changes. But today, given the current state of affairs and the clear dangers social media is posing to society, I'm more open to the amend Section 230 camp than I used to be. And just to drive home my initial point about how tiresome this has become, the blame can't be placed solely on social media companies. Despite my lengthy engagement with my colleagues before introducing my bills, and even after making changes to the bills based on their feedback, I could not find a partner on the other side of the aisle to lock arms with me, take a stand, and put something bipartisan out there to at least get the conversation going. Honestly, there are ideas coming from both sides of the dais that are worthy of debating. But the devil's always in the details. But if we're not even trying to engage in a bipartisan process, we're never going to get a strong or lasting set of policy solutions. I'm disappointed it's taken my colleagues nearly a year to engage with me on this issue, but I hope this hearing is a first step of many steps that seemingly we've already had to join together and hold big tech accountable. Ms. Haugen, I want to thank you directly for your recent efforts to bring about a broader conversation about the harms of social media. As you may recall, in the spring of 2018, Mark Zuckerberg testified before us. During the course of that hearing, he stated that Facebook has a responsibility to protect its users. Do you agree that Facebook and other social media companies have a responsibility to protect their users? And if you do you believe that they are fulfilling that responsibility?
I do believe they have a duty to protect their users. I want to remind everyone in this room that in the majority of languages in the world, Facebook is the internet. 80 to 90% of all the content in that language will be on Facebook. In a world where Facebook holds that much power, they have an extra high duty to protect. I do not believe they are upfilling that duty today because of a variety of organizational incentives that are misaligned, and Congress must act in order to realign those incentives.
I agree with you. Ms. Frederick, let me ask you, you're also a former Facebook employee as part of their Global Security Counterterrorism Analysis Program, so I'm going to ask you the same question. Do Facebook and other social media companies have a responsibility to protect their users, and are they fulfilling that responsibility?
They do have a responsibility to protect their users. The days of only blaming the addict and letting the dealer get off scot-free are over. I think everybody recognizes this at that point. And I want to say in October of 2019, Mark Zuckerberg stood on the stage at Georgetown University and said Facebook was going to be the platform that stands up for freedom of expression. He has rankly abrogated those values, and the difference between what these companies say and what they actually do is now a yawning chasm.
It's been reported and discussed today that algorithms employed by some of the biggest companies tend to lead users to content which reinforces their existing belief, or worse, to which causes anxiety, fear, and anger, all of which have been shown to lead to increase engagement from the user regardless of their damaging effects. So Ms. Frederick, given your background, can you describe the national security concerns with the ways in which social media companies design and employ those? And if we have time, Ms. Haugen, too.
Yeah, I went to work for Facebook because I believed in the danger of foreign Islamic terrorism. I went to make sure that the platform was hostile to those bad actors, illegal actors, and I think I think we can imbue technology with our values. This is the whole concept behind privacy by design, and you need to let those programmers who actually code these algorithms, they need to be transparent about what they're doing and how they operate and how they impact users as well.
I am extremely concerned about Facebook's role in things like counterterrorism or other counter-state actors that are weaponizing the platform. Facebook is chronically underinvested in those capacities, and if you knew the size of the counterterrorism team for the threat investigators, you'd be shocked. Like, I'm pretty sure it's under like 10 people. This should be something that is publicly listed because they need to be funding hundreds of people, not 10 people.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses, and thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. McEachin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to say to my colleague and friend, Kinsinzer, forgive me for butchering your name, that I appreciate your comments about partisanship. I share them with the notion of if we're going to have something that's going to last, Congress changes in parties and whatnot, we're going to need to have something that's bipartisan. And I invite you to take a look at the SAFE Act, which I think takes a unique and different approach to Section 230 liability. That being said, colleagues, I would ask all of you all to rethink or really understand the message we're sending when we talk about immunity. Because when we say immunity, what we're really saying is that we don't trust juries. Think about that. We don't trust a jury properly instructed to get it right. That's the only reason you'd have immunity, because you're afraid the jury's going to get it wrong. Remember, my colleagues, that juries are composed of the same people who send us to Congress. They're the people who trust us to make trillion-dollar judgments, to decide war and peace, to decide any number of things. If they're wise enough to do that, why are we so arrogant to believe that they're not wise enough, when properly impaneled, properly instructed by a jury, that they can't get it right? And so I want you to start thinking about immunity in that context as we go forward, if you would be so kind to do so. I'd like to direct my first question, Mr. Chairman, to the color of change, Ms. Robinson. And I note that you say that there are 3 ways that we know we're headed towards a real solution. And the first one jumps out at me and says that laws and regulations must be crystal clear. Now, when I came to Congress, I was just a small-town lawyer trying to make good, and I don't know what an algorithm is from a rhythm and blues section, quite frankly. But I do know how to say that immunity is not available if you violate civil rights. Immunity is not available for any number of legal actions. That's the approach the Safe Tech Act takes. Do you see that as meeting your first criteria? Can you comment on how and if you believe the Safe Act will ultimately help with big tech abuses?
Absolutely. I do believe that it meets that mark. I believe that it meets the mark because the fact of the matter is that Facebook, Twitter, Google, Amazon, they've all come before you and have explained that they are not subject to civil rights law and that they can get around the laws on the books and create all sorts of harms through the choices that they're making. And right now, we need a set of laws that make it so that they are not immune. And your point around juries, and I would add regulators, I would add sort of the infrastructure that we have in this country to hold institutions accountable, gets thrown out the window when we're dealing with tech companies out in Silicon Valley, because somehow they exist on a completely different plane and are allowed to have a completely different set of rules than everyone else. And the fact of the matter is freedom of speech is not freedom from the consequences of speech. This is not about throwing someone in jail. This is about ensuring that if you say things that are deeply liable, if you incite violence, if you incite hate, that you can be held accountable for that. And that if you are recommending folks to that and you are moving people through paid advertisement and your business model is amplifying that there is accountability baked into it. And I don't understand why we continue to let these platforms make billions of dollars off of violating things that we have worked hard in this country to move forward on. And that, I think, is why really understanding the difference between solutions that are real and solutions that are fake, and I think the SAFE Act gets us there as one of the pieces of legislation that we need to consider.
Mr. Robinson, I would ask you, do you agree with me that just because the immunity is removed doesn't mean the plaintiffs are all of a sudden going to win every lawsuit?
No, of course not. And I don't think anyone here believes that. But what it does mean is that we end up actually being in a place where there can be some level of accountability. And you don't end up having a situation where Mark Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg or Jack or anyone else can come here and sit before you and lie about what their platforms are doing, decide when they're going to be transparent or not, and walk away and feel like absolutely no accountability. And this is not just impacting Black communities, this is impacting evangelical communities, this is impacting LGBTQ communities, this is impacting women, it's impacting people at the intersection of so many different experiences in life that we have allowed these companies to operate in ways that is completely outside of what our rules should look like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your patience and allowing me to trespass on your time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Bilirakis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I want to focus my questions on the Section 230, how it interacts with child exploitation online. In 2019, research from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported that child pornography has grown to nearly 1 million detected events per month, exceeding the capabilities of law enforcement. That number increased to over 21 million in 2020 and is on track to grow again this year, unfortunately. Mrs. Frederick, if a tech company knows about a particular instance of child pornography on its platform, but decides to ignore it and permit its distribution, would Section 230 prevent the victim from suing the tech company?
I would say that given Section 230's broad interpretations by the courts, companies have historically avoided liability for hosting similar content.
Okay. As a follow-up, if a brick and mortar store knowingly distributes child pornography, can the victim sue that particular business, in your opinion?
Yes, obviously.
Thank you. I don't see any reason why we should be giving special immunities, Mr. Chairman, to online platforms that don't exist for other businesses when it comes to a business knowingly exploiting our children and facilitating child pornography. It would be a discredit to us all to allow this to continue, which is why I have a public bill draft, I think you can see, that seeks to end this despicable protection. So I request bipartisan support in this matter. I think we have agreement. In general, I believe we have agreement. And this is a very, very informative hearing, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling it. I yield back the balance of my time. I know you'll like that. And by the way, the Pirates do have a bright future. Thank you.
I can only hope you're right about that, Gus. Let's see. Chair recognizes Mr. Vesey for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for holding this very important hearing on 230. It's really timely and critical that we start talking about how we can move the needle on this issue and hold big tech accountable. We know that recent reports demonstrate concerning trends that should put every member of this committee and certainly every member of Congress on alert about the shortcomings of big tech and their repeated promise to self-regulate. I'm optimistic that we can get something done because I really do think that social media platforms are no question a major source of and a dominant source of news now in our lives, whether it's entertainment, personal connections, news, even local news, advertising. All of that happens in the social media world. But we also continue to see social media platforms acting in a problematic way, in some instances even endangering the lives of very young kids. And today is no different. Social media platforms continue to behave without an honest, solution-oriented approach to stop the spread of misinformation, to manipulate public opinion. And we know rampant disinformation about things like voter fraud is still present in our communities. And as this new variant of COVID-19 lurks around the corner, Congress really needs to act now so we can stop the misspread of misinformation around COVID-19 and this new variant that's about to come through. It's very disconcerting to think about some of the things that we're about to hear about this new variant that's just a bunch of BS. And while social media platforms continue to flourish and the number of users they are able to keep on their platform, the number of reported harms associated with social media is just one of many consequences we are seeing as a result of big tech business practices. For instance, the Anti-Defamation League says that about 41% of Americans experience some form of online harassment next year. So doing nothing is not an answer. We have to do something. And I think that we can do that. And I wanted to ask the panel a question. Again, there's no doubt that big tech companies have just been flat-footed when it comes to getting ahead of removing harmful content and disinformation on the most popular social media platforms. Ms. Frances Haugen, you mentioned numerous times during your interview on 60 Minutes that you wanted to show that Facebook cares about profits more than public safety. In November of this year, Facebook, which has now rebranded itself as Meta, announced that it is working with the civil rights communities, privacy experts, and others to create a race data measurement. Given your experience and background in the field, can you talk about how Facebook incorporates such recommendations into these types of measuring tools? And is there a criteria or a set of guidelines that Facebook is considering when shaping the product?
While I was there, I was not aware of any actions around analyzing whether or not there was a racial bias in things like ranking. One of the things that could be disclosed by Facebook but does not is the concentration of harm on the platform. So for every single integrity harm type, every safety harm type, a small fraction of the users are hyper-exposed to that harm. It could be misinformation, it could be hate speech, and Facebook has ways to report that data in a privacy-conscious way today that will allow you to know whether or not harms across the platform were equally borne. But they don't do it.
So this new tool that they're talking about creating, do you see any potential drawbacks to creating such measurement, which is supposedly going to increase fairness when it comes to race in the U.S. on this platform? Is there anything that we should be on the lookout for?
When I was working on narrowcast misinformation, we developed this system for segmenting the U.S. population in a privacy-conscious way. We looked at the groups and pages that people interacted with and then clustered them in a non-labeled way. So we're not assigning race to anyone, we're not assigning any other characteristics, but we're looking at, when we look at consistent populations, do they experience harms in an unequal way? I don't believe there would be any harms for Facebook reporting this data, and I believe it is a responsibility of the company to disclose the unequal treatment on the platform, because it's the only way. If they're not held accountable, if there's not transparency, they will not improve. There's no business incentive for them to get this more equitable if it comes at a loss in profits.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, this topic we're discussing today is certainly not a new one. This committee has told big tech that they cannot claim to be simply platforms for third-party information distribution while simultaneously acting as content providers and removing lawful content based on political or ideological preferences. In other words, big tech cannot be both tech platform and content provider while still receiving special protections under Section 230. Free speech involves not only being able to say what you believe, but also protecting free speech for those with whom you strongly disagree. That's fundamental in America. And big tech should not be granted the right to choose when this right to free speech is allowed, or when they should prefer to hide, edit, or censor lawful speech on their platforms. They are not the arbiters of the freedoms constitutionally provided to the American people. This committee has brought in big tech CEOs numerous times now. So far, they have chosen to arrogantly deflect our questions and ignore the issues we've presented to them. It took a whistleblower, whom we're fortunate to have with us today, to expose the harm that Facebook and other social media platforms are causing, especially to children and teens at an impressionable age. That harm concerns me. I have a discussion draft that would require companies to disclose the mental health impact their products and services have on children. Perhaps such requirements would prevent the need for a whistleblower to expose highly concerning revelations, including that executives knew the content of their social media platforms are toxic for teenage girls. And perhaps it would incentivize these executives to come back to us with solutions that enable a safer online experience for its users, rather than attempting to debunk the evidence of their toxicity. However, we also must be careful when considering reforms to Section 230, as overregulation could actually lead to additional suppression of free speech. It is our intent to protect consumers while simultaneously enabling American innovation to grow and thrive without burdensome government regulation.
Enter the event panelist numeric password, followed by pound.
Don't know who that was. That wasn't me, Mr. Chairman. That's not my accent, as you can tell. Ms. Frederick, the Chinese Communist Party has multiple agencies dedicated to propaganda. From the Ministry for Information Industry, which regulates anyone providing information to the public via the internet, to the Central Propaganda Department, which exercises censorship powers through licensing of publishers. How do big tech's actions compare to those of the CCP, the Chinese, when it comes to censoring content?
I'd say that a healthy republic depends on the genuine interrogation of ideas. And having said that, I am very troubled by what I see as an increasing symbiosis between the government and big tech companies. I talked about Psaki's press conference, but what I didn't say is in that July press conference, again, from the White House podium, she said if one user is banned from one private company, they should be banned from all private companies' platforms. That, to me, is harrowing. What company is going to want to start up if 50% of their user base is automatically gone because the government says so? Yeah. So in my mind, that increasing symbiosis between the government and tech companies is very reminiscent of what the CCP does, and it should be stopped.
Ms. Haugen, in your testimony to the UK Parliament, you recommend that a federal regulator should have access to platforms' internal processes and the ability to regulate their process for removing content. Just yesterday, one of my Democrat colleagues agreed with your recommendation for more government intervention. I'm seriously troubled by my colleagues thinking that government involvement in private business operations to regulate content is even an option to put on the table. Bigger government means less innovation, less production, and less progress, not to mention the very serious First Amendment implications. This is un-American. Ms. Frederick, quickly, can you talk about the negative impacts this approach would cause?
It's authoritarianism.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I was mischaracterized. The only thing I've advocated for is transparency and the government mandating that Facebook must articulate what it's doing to solve problems, Because today, they lie to us, they give us false data when they rarely give any data, and they always just say, we're working on it. They never actually give progress. So I just want to clarify my opinions.
Gentleman
Okay,
yields
thank you.
back.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lies about the vaccines, lies about the 2020 election, lies about the January 6th insurrection all proliferate on social media to this day. It seems like as we're working on key reforms like protecting civil rights, accountability for social media companies, protecting our kids, the main opposition by Republicans today, the talking point of the day, is they want a license to lie, the right to lie without consequence, even though deliberate lies are not free speech under New York Times v. Sullivan, according to our Supreme Court. What was scenario number one? Tom Cotton, Senator Cotton, referring to his Wuhan lab theory. He literally said, quote, "We don't have evidence that this disease originated there," to the New York Times. Yet radical right-wing media then goes on to say the virus is part of China's biowarfare program. That's a terrible example to use. And then after President Trump was impeached for collusion with Ukraine, you want to talk about a Hunter Biden laptop? Really? I'm deeply concerned about how these things are already spreading in Spanish language media as well. I got to speak to Mr. Zuckerberg in March about that, and he said there's too much misinformation across all these media. He mentioned deterministic products like WhatsApp, and they also said, quote, "There were certainly some of this content on Facebook, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we're building effective systems that can reduce the spread of that. I think a lot of those systems performed well during this election cycle, but it's an iterative process, and there are always going to be new things that we'll need to do to keep up with the different threats we face." Then I asked him to commit to boosting Spanish language moderators and systems on Facebook, especially during election season, to prevent this from happening again. Ms. Haugen, you left Facebook about 2 months after that hearing in May, and has there been significant updates since that hearing on protecting Spanish misinformation? In short, has Mark Zuckerberg kept his word?
I do not know the progress of the company since I left. I do know before I left, there was a significant asymmetry in the investment in safety systems. We live in a very linguistically diverse country, and yet Facebook has overwhelmingly, 87% of its budget for misinformation is spent exclusively on English. All the rest of the world falls into that remaining 13%. When we live in a linguistically diverse society where there aren't safety systems for non-English speakers, we open up the doors to dividing our country and being pulled apart because the most extreme content is getting the most distribution for those populations.
And you had mentioned specifically in other hearings about Ethiopia and the concern with there. Can you go into that a little more?
We are seeing a trend in many countries around the world where parties are arising based on implying that certain populations within their societies are subhuman, right? One of the warning signs for ethnic violence is when leaders begin to refer to a minority as things like insects or rodents, right? Dehumanizing them. At the same time, because Facebook's algorithms give the most reach to the most extreme content, Facebook ends up fanning the flames of this extremism around the world. And in the case of Ethiopia and Myanmar, that's resulted in people dying.
Thank you, Ms. Haugen. Mr. Robinson, we also see a lot of lies and misinformation related to the vaccines. How has misinformation impacted communities of color taking the COVID-19 vaccine?
Well, because of the ways in which Facebook is not transparent about their algorithms, transparent about how ads can be deployed, we actually don't have a full understanding of what we're dealing with. Because, we are dealing with, deep levels of deceptive and manipulative content, content that gets to travel and can travel far within subsects of communities, but without any clarity of what's happening until it's sometimes far too late, until you can't actually deal with it. The ways in which money can be put behind those for paid advertisement to sell people things that are not approved, that haven't been tested. In opening statements, we heard about drugs being sold online and being marketed through algorithms, and that's exactly what we're seeing when it comes to Black communities.
And Mr.
because-
Mr. Robinson, sorry, my time's limited. Would you say misinformation reduces vaccination rates among communities of color with the COVID-19?
It can both reduce vaccination rates and increase people going down rabbit holes of using all sorts of untested drugs.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Long for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Ms. Haugen, the third pillar of the Big Tech Accountability Platform is addressing Big Tech's relationship with China.
Mm-hmm.
Much of the information you brought forward discusses the challenges associated with Facebook's business model and how it chooses content that users see on their platform, which leads to many of the harms that the platform causes today. We're looking at this issue all across Big Tech, not just on Facebook. One of the platforms we're paying close attention to, as you know, is TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
Reports suggest that TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, coordinates with the Chinese Communist Party to facilitate abuses against Uyghur Muslims and pressure United States-based employees to censor videos that the Chinese Communist Party finds culturally problematic or critical of the Chinese Communist Party. How does TikTok's platform business model make it ripe for being censored by China?
That is a wonderful question. So I often get asked questions about the difference between personal social media, which is what Facebook is, you're connecting with your family and friends, and what I call broadcast social media, where people create in order to get reach. TikTok is specifically designed with no contract between the viewer and the content they receive. You get shown things, you don't know exactly why you got shown them. And the way Facebook or TikTok works is they push people towards a very limited number of pieces of content. You can probably run 50% of everything that's viewed every day with a few thousand pieces of content per day. That system was designed that way so that you could censor it. Like when it was in China, they're intentionally set up so that humans can look at that high distribution content and choose what goes forward or not. TikTok is designed to be censored.
Okay, thank you. And question for you, Ms. Frederick. Your testimony makes clear that holding Big Tech accountable means increasing transparency into their practices. You also have a background in national security. We don't know how TikTok monitors its platforms or censors its content. They could easily be doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party, and we wouldn't know anything about it. How do you, do you have recommendations on how we can increase Big Tech's transparency? For example, how do we know if the content viewed by Americans on TikTok isn't spreading communist propaganda?
I would say incentivize transparency. Certain companies of their own volition right now, they give quarterly reports on how they interact with law enforcement, how they employ their community standards, but other tech companies are not doing this. So there has to be some teeth when you incentivize that transparency among tech companies. And when it comes to TikTok in particular, as you said, parent company headquartered in Beijing, you have to assume that they are beholden to the CCP in this instance. The governance atmosphere of China, the 2017 cybersecurity law, the national security laws, basically say that whatever private companies do, whatever data they ingest, however they interact, all of it is subject to the CCP when it comes knocking. So in my estimation, I don't believe any American right now should be on TikTok. And there are social contagion elements there as well. The algorithm, their secret sauce, it is crazily wants user engagement. And 9 to 11-year-olds, parents were surveyed. And of 9 to 11-year-old Americans, these parents said 30% of them are on TikTok. This is more than Instagram, this is more than Facebook, this is more than Snap. So when we think about the formation of our young minds in this country, we have to understand that ByteDance, that a Beijing-based company, has their hooks in our children, and we need to act accordingly.
So you say that the parents are saying that 30% of their children are on TikTok.
30% of parents say that their children are on TikTok. 9 to 11-year-olds in particular. So
I'd say that there's probably another 30% that don't know what their kids are looking at. I mean, I think it's a lot higher number than 30 in my opinion.
TikTok's hyper-amplification algorithms also make it even more addictive than TikTok because they can choose the absolute purest addictive content and spread it to the most audience. So I agree with her. This is a very dangerous thing, and it's affecting very young children.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing today, and thank you all for your participation here today. I really, really appreciate it because it's a very, very serious subject, as we all know. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. O'Halloran for 5 minutes.
There we go. Thank you, Chairman Doyle. There's no doubt about the positive and negative impacts of the technology platforms have in our society today. We've been talking about it all day long. As a father, grandfather, and like many Americans, I was outraged and am outraged to read about the inner workings of Facebook brought to light by Ms. Haugen. Facebook is recklessness, disregard for the well-being of children and teenagers, especially given their internal research. This is completely unacceptable. Instead of using Facebook and Instagram to create positive and social experience for minors, Facebook is exploiting our children and grandchildren for clicks and ad revenue. This is a particular problem for teenage girls. Facebook's own internal research found that using Instagram made teenage girls feel worse about themselves, leading to depression, eating disorders, and thoughts of suicide, and yes, even death. I don't know how they can come up with these decisions that they've come up with. I'm a former homicide investigator, as well as a father and grandfather. I've seen a lot of suicide. I've witnessed a lot of death in our country. And I don't know how somebody can make these decisions knowing the information they knew and the impact it was going to have on the families and children within our society today. Facebook thinks it's okay. I think this is, again, an outrage. This is clear evidence that something needs to change. We need transparency for companies like Facebook. We need to know what they are showing our children and why, and to identify how these algorithms come together and what impact they will have on the rest of our society. We can't have Facebook and their algorithms taking advantage of our children. Our children and families are more than just out there for corporate greed. Tech corporations also have a moral responsibility to children and families in our country in general and the rest of the world. Ms. Haugen, can you tell us more about how Instagram uses demographics and a user's